Good evening, everybody. This is Brian John speaking from my super sophisticated studio in West Wales. Sorry, you might have missed the beginning there. Let's start again. Brian John speaking from West Wales, my super deluxe studio deep in the countryside. And this is the Angel Mountain Show, episode number 2. Many of you, of course, who are looking this evening will know the Angel Mountain Saga. It's a series of 8 novels which I've written over the course of the last 20 years, featuring a rather eccentric heroine called Martha Morgan. It sold very well, and we've got a very big following. But for those of you that might not know the books, a very big welcome to you. Nice to make contact with you. And just to mention right at the very beginning that you can share and like this video, if you will, according to Facebook tradition. And if you'd like to sign up for the newsletter for the Angel Mountain Saga, you can do that via our website, and there is a link on the Facebook page. I'm sorry I can't actually see comments at the moment while I'm doing this video chat, but on the other hand, you can leave comments on the Facebook page if you like, and I will try to deal with any comments or questions in future episodes. I'm planning to do a series of 7 videos on successive evenings over the course of the next few days. And then I'll take a little break and review things and see how it's gone. But there are effectively an endless series of topics that I can talk about relating to the heroine of the stories, how the stories came to me, etc., etc. Lots of different topics. Supernatural element is another thing that is something I get frequently asked about. But let's start at the very beginning. And the first question that I'm asked by people when they encounter the series is this: how is it that an elderly gentleman like myself came to write a series of novels in the voice initially of a pregnant suicidal teenager living in Regency, Wales, in a very turbulent time? And why did I choose to write in this female voice, in the first person, in the novels, in the form of a diary? And the answer to that question is a little bit spooky and rather strange. It all started in 1999, when my wife and myself were heading for a holiday on Gran Canaria. My wife's mother had an apartment there at the time, and we used to go down to the apartment once or twice a year, if we could, to seek the sunshine. So in the autumn of 1999, we were on a flight to Gran Canaria. And as the flight proceeded, it's only a 4-hour flight or something like that. As the flight proceeded, I felt increasingly unwell. And by the time we'd actually landed at Las Palmas in Gran Canaria, I was feeling really quite horrible. I had a very high temperature. I was, my limbs felt heavy. I had a splitting headache. I really felt very unwell. They were all rather typical flu-like symptoms. And as we got off the aeroplane and got the bus out to the apartment, I felt worse and worse, in fact. And when we actually got to the apartment, I felt absolutely horrible, crashed out, went straight to bed, and hoped that I would get some sleep and would recover. But I was quite convinced that I had caught a rather nasty bout of the flu, although it did come on extremely suddenly. Anyway, during the course of the night, I was wide awake the whole night. I didn't sleep a wink. And a very strange thing happened during this. I must have been in a state of delirium, I suppose. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And certainly I've experienced nothing like it since. And I promise you that I hadn't taken any interesting substances or anything. So this was a completely strange episode, and it was a rather spooky one, because while I lay in bed with my wife fast asleep next to me, I heard this strange voice, a female voice, speaking to me with a very strong Welsh accent. She revealed to me that her name was Martha Morgan, and she proceeded to tell me her life story, in effect, during the course of the night. it wasn't a dream, because I remembered everything in enormous detail afterwards. And of course, with dreams, you tend not to remember things. And so this narrative unfolded during the course of the night, spoken to me by Mistress Martha in extraordinary detail. Not only events, but the characters in the story, the places in the story. The story was set on the little mountain of Carningly, close to where I live. And the house that she lived in was a place called Plas Ingley. There is actually a ruined cottage on the side of the mountain, and I suppose in some way this might have been the place that insinuated its way into my memory or into my fantasy while this delirious episode was going on. I proceeded to pick up on virtually the whole of Martha Morgan's life story, from the time when she was a pregnant and suicidal teenager who was being forced into a shotgun marriage, very much against her will, as a consequence of which she was, at the beginning of the story, very suicidal, wanted to simply throw herself off a high cliff. But as the story proceeded, she got through this particular episode and then embarked upon a very long and rather eccentric life, packed full of assorted adventures and packed full of involvement in many of the key historical episodes that occurred in West Wales during the Regency and early Victorian period. Excuse me, let's take a little sip. So at the end of this particular episode, early in the morning, when my wife woke up, and there was I, still wide awake, the first thing I did was to tell her I've had this very strange experience during the night. And so I told her about the episode and about the story and about this woman called Martha Morgan who'd been speaking to me in the night. And her first instinct was, when I said, look, this wasn't a dream, this was a gift of some sort, maybe, I don't know. That's still what I actually think, that it probably was some sort of a gift. Anyway, her first response was, well, start writing. And the reason why she said that, I suppose, was that she had been trying to encourage me for many years to embark upon the writing of some fiction. I've never written any fiction before. I had actually written a lot of textbooks and books of local folk tales and books that are aimed at the tourist market, for example. I'd written about 70 or 80 books, I suppose, at this stage. So I had quite a long track record of writing things. But I'd always thought that the people who write fiction have got different sort of minds from people who write scientific textbooks, for example. So I thought that maybe I had rather more on the right-hand side of my brain than on the left-hand side, or vice versa, whichever way around it is. So I thought I wasn't instinctively a fiction writer, but my wife, I suppose, appreciated that maybe I did have some fiction writing in me, and encouraged me to simply set down immediately and get on with the writing. And the strange thing was that around about breakfast time, this whole episode disappeared. My temperature dropped. The headache was gone, and I felt less heavy and less queasy. And so the whole episode only lasted for about 12 hours. And I think now that it wasn't a virus, it wasn't a flu virus or anything. I think it was actually this thing called aerotoxic syndrome, which is something that is very much underreported, but it happens quite often on aircraft where the cabin air is circulated and bled through the engine. It's sometimes somehow used to give a boost to the performance of the jet engines, and then it's bled back into the cabin again. And of course, when it comes back into the cabin during this circulation process, there are lots of toxic materials in the cabin air. And some people are affected by this and most people aren't. And in the worst occasions when this has happened, it's all on the record, virtually the whole of a cabin crew have been affected, including pilot and co-pilot. So one day there's going to be an almighty disaster, a plane crash, I think, caused directly by the use of polluted cabin air. But most people, of course, like myself, get off the plane, get home, and immediately start feeling a bit better after a few hours. And then they think, oh, maybe I just picked something up, some sort of bug. Now I feel better. Let's forget about it. And so most people don't even report that they have had an episode of this type. So I think that's what actually happened to me. And that's what triggered this delirious episode. So from that point on, I actually had my laptop computer with me on holiday, as one does, and I started writing. And from that point on, I simply had to learn the art and the craft of creating a story, or writing a story down, not creating it. The creation of the story was already done because it was already in my head as a consequence of this very spooky and rather strange episode. So I didn't have to invent anything, actually. I simply followed and tried to record as faithfully as I could what had actually been revealed to me through the voice of Mistress Martha Morgan during the course of that night. It took me about 18 months, I suppose, to write the first version of the first book, which was on Angel Mountain. I assumed that it would take one novel to actually tell Mistress Martha's life story. More fool I, because by the time I had completed what I thought was a reasonable length novel, and it had reached an adequate conclusion with a very dramatic finale, still only 1 year of her life had passed, and there was still all the rest of her life stretching away into the future, because she lives to a ripe old age of 76 or 77 years old. So there's an awful lot still left at the end of the first story. And so I thought, well, anyway, we'll see. We'll publish this first story and see if anybody out there is interested in it. And if there is an interest, if people seem to like it, then maybe I can embark upon volume number 2 and maybe volume number 3, or however many it takes to tell Martha Morgan's life story. So that's how the whole story came to me. It's very spooky. I still don't quite know what to make of it. I've often been asked, well, did Martha Morgan actually exist, or did she not? I've done a lot of research and I can't actually find anybody with that name living in the right place. But one thing that I had to do in order to be true to the gift of the story was that I had to narrate the story in Martha's own voice, which is not easy for somebody like I was 60 at the time when this episode happened. I was already a grandfather. For me as a male of mature years to even think about writing in the voice of a pregnant and suicide female in another age in Regency Wales, when all sorts of understandings, all sorts of perceptions, traditions, patterns of speaking, etc., were completely different from those of today. So I had to try to do that, and so I decided right from the beginning the whole story would be told in the first person, in Martha's own voice, as authentically as I possibly could, which was a major challenge, of course, and I was always very worried right from the very beginning that people just wouldn't buy into this at all, because it was such a peculiar thing to be doing. And this is where my wife came in very much, because as I wrote the stories one after another, she was always hassling me, right? I want to read the next bit. I want to read the next bit. And there are many, many occasions during the course of Martha Morgan's life history, as now told over the course of 8 novels, where she said, no, a woman wouldn't have responded like this. She would have responded like this, or she wouldn't have said that, or she wouldn't have reacted with those particular words. This doesn't ring true. So she put me right on many occasions, I have to say. But I hope that now the voice of Martha in the stories is reasonably authentic, reasonably convincing. And I suppose it must be, because quite a lot of people have clearly enjoyed the stories and have bought one novel after another. And I know for a fact that there are some people out there who seem to do nothing much else other than reading the Angel Mountain stories. They read all 8 of them and then they start at the beginning again. So they know the stories far better than I do. Anyway, the pattern of publication of the stories, how they got into print, how the stories were published one after another, and the adventures that I actually had to go through in order to get them published in the first place, and in order to sell them, and in order to make the series into the modest success that it is, that really is another story. So I'll keep that for another evening. But for the present, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little chat. And if you do have any comments, please be free to put them onto the comments page on the comments section on the Facebook page, and I'll see if I can deal with those questions as honestly as I can in future chats in this little series. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye and keep safe.